Yeah, my relationship to the Columbia River dates back to almost my first arrival in the region in the mid 1990s. I noticed all the water we had in this region, and I noticed the lack of Indigenous historical presence, and I felt that there was a story there about what had happened to the Columbia. As soon as I began to explore the Indigenous people and their story, I encountered the story of the Columbia River and how it was transformed from a natural river system and ecosystem that thrived into a system of hydroelectric development. The displacement of the Sinixt had a lot to do with the British Columbia government and their general attitude toward Indigenous people as settlers moved into the region, into this particular region around the 1880s, 1890s. And the emphasis of settlement had to do with gold extraction and with agriculture. And in this particular region, like in the other regions of the province, the Indigenous people and their methods of using the land base and their very presence on the land was intrusive of the settler culture and what they expected or wanted to be able to do. In this particular area, it was a twist that we had the international boundaries so close, and we had an Indigenous people who traveled back and forth traditionally across the border. Well, this was not a border for them. 20% of their traditional territory was in what we now call Washington State, and 80% of it was surrounding the main stem of the Columbia and the Kootenay Lake system. 80% of it was around that area. So I think that what happened because of the narrow valleys and a bit of restriction on available land, it was a magnified issue when the settlers moved in. They had far less places where they could filter out into. And so they naturally drifted south, in part because the U.S. had established a reservation there 30 to 50 years earlier. And so for the Sinixt, there was a safe haven there where families could gather and be present. I think it's important to emphasize when we talk about displacement, I think the way the historical record treated this issue and the way the Crown government of British Columbia continues to position themselves on the issue of the Sinixt and their displacement is that they were just sort of naturally drifting away from their traditional territory, which in fact is absolutely untrue and not borne out by their own version of the story. Their own version of the story is they were, in a sense, refugees who had nowhere safe that they felt they could be. And with the delay in the region's isolation, I think, contributed to the federal government of Canada, who controlled Indian affairs and at the time and still does, being delayed for a variety of reasons, some intentional and some not intentional, in getting themselves into the region to understand where a reserve should be placed. And because of this long delay between a reservation being established in the United States and a reserve being established in Canada, not until 1903, that 30-year gap ended up creating a pattern of movement to a safe place that was then difficult to reverse, especially with the reserve in Canada being set up in a very isolated place without road access, without a school, without medical care. And I think that contributed to the displacement, and I think it's very important as we look at this story not to accept one brief period's historical interpretation of what happened from the settler perspective. And so when the settler culture arrived, well, first it was the railway that came through and disturbed what had been the Sinixt territorial use. And then in following to the railway and the mining episodes, then we had settler culture coming for agriculture. And so you had a very fertile valley that was a floodplain, actually, south of Revelstoke, from Revelstoke to the north end of Kootenay Lake, what we think of today as Revelstoke Reach, was a lot of wetland. And that wetland system had tremendous richness in its soils, built up over many thousands of years of deposition of silts. And so it was a natural place for agriculture to move in, which it did. But You know, the history of the British Columbia government's settlement of the outer-lying areas from the coast is a history of industrial use, and agriculture had such a narrow application within that larger story of industrial use. And so what happened with agriculture is that even as the BC government was still producing pamphlets celebrating the riches of the Arrow Lakes Valley and the Revelstoke Reach for agriculture, they were laying tracks to flood the entire valley through the construction of hydroelectric developments under the Columbia River Treaty and after. This second layer of displacement, in some ways, for me as a historian and researcher, the account of this second layer of displacement it hit me even harder, I think, in part because of the fact that it was a second layer, and I was still in recovery from learning about the displacement of our Indigenous people when I encountered this next layer. And so it was partly that, cumulative, and it was partly because of lies and mistruths and a broken trust between the people who came and through the sweat of their brow developed land in an agricultural fashion that led them to love the land. In a very short number of generations, people grew very attached to the land. And so to me, it was that double whammy of displacement that there are no words really to describe the depth of loss. On many levels, one of which is a population that is of individuals, human beings, that are allowed to love where they live, that are allowed to bond to it, that are allowed to interact with natural systems the way agricultural people do. They live differently on the land than people who live in urban areas. And this was, to me, just it was a crescendo from the displacement of the Indigenous people. And it's a very classic example, I think, of what happens when large-scale industry gets hold of a landscape. And a lot of people don't think of hydroelectric development necessarily as industrial development. We think of factories and we think of sawmills, but this is an industrially developed region. And nowhere is it more true in a concentrated fashion than in the areas that back up water behind the Columbia River Treaty dams. So the displacement process for the settler culture was, in its own way, as insensitive to them as the government had been toward the Indigenous people. It was very much a question of a fait accompli, this is going to happen. Major decisions were made in Ottawa and Washington, D.C. with absolutely no realistic consultation. Rumors were spreading. It was a different era in terms of public communication. And so news trickled into this remote valley a little more slowly even than into other areas. And so the valley became, and its residents became, a handmaiden to the whole process. And as a result, it was just a few months prior to the Columbia River Treaty being signed. It was not until the late fall of 1960 that any real information about the solidity of the agreement that was about to be signed came into the valley, leaving people a very, very short amount of time to have any democratic input whatsoever. And what proceeded from that was truly a very undemocratic process that is a hidden story, a dark hidden story in Canadian history. And that was that a lot of residents were approached by government agencies that were ill prepared to meet up with the love and loyalty of landowners. And they were extremely insensitive, and they based the valuing of the property on what the value would be of soon-to-be flooded property. And as a result of that, the property values were unnaturally low. Of course, any property that was soon to be a reservoir was going to have a limited value. And so the way in which they valued the property was problematic, and the way in which they approached people. One of the legendary stories I encountered was from a Revelstoke resident who was a boy at the time, who was running through the woods with his brother playing on his family farm and encountered yellow stakes in the ground that had been placed there by the engineering survey teams who were marking out the high water level of the new reservoir. And these young boys were certain that if they lifted those yellow stakes up, that would somehow mean that their family farm would not be flooded. So there was very poor communication and very undignified interactions. There were times when neighbors' houses were set on fire to clear for the reservoir, and other neighbors weren't informed of these fires being set, and they would be in a panic thinking someone's house is on fire and try to rush to go and help them, and find BC Hydro agents laughing really about this easy clearing that they had just done, and watching a home be destroyed. It had been vacated, obviously. So I would say in terms of insensitivity, I'm not sure it even could measure on any scale. It's way beyond the scale of what is a human decency. And Canada has many other stories like this. This region is not unusual. What I feel is unusual is that, in part because of the actions of the reservoir and the enormous amount of money that is being produced in this region through hydroelectricity, that it has contributed to the suppression of the story. I think just as the reservoir waters come up and cover the old town sites, the story itself is, to a degree, still being suppressed actively within Canadian history and is not well enough known, in part because nobody wants to admit how bad it was. It was not a good scene. It was not a democratic process, and it was it contravenes or contradicts this impression of the nice Canadian that is held in the world. And we cannot go back and change history, but we can certainly account for it and honor and apologize to those who were harmed. Instead, we are persisting as a government with the extinction of our Indigenous people, fighting them in the courts, and we are refusing to acknowledge the great psychological harm that was done to a lot of these people who were displaced. And in my view, from reading the history and interviewing some of them, I don't think it's a stretch to say that there is still a post-traumatic stress disorder alive in these families. And so my work as a historian on this subject has catapulted me forward sometimes into the present day, where I receive a call from someone who is associated with the story, whose family farm was destroyed, where I can still feel and hear the trauma in their voices, and I find myself calming them or wanting to soothe them, because I can see and feel that even though they're in their 70s and 1968 or 64 or 61 is a fairly long time ago now, the impact of our policies and our, quite frankly, greed through the Columbia River Treaty process, there are still people who are suffering from that. When I wrote A River Captured, my first draft of it was so angry, almost no one could read it. And I had to shelve it. I had to let it sit on a shelf for several years. And I just could not believe what had happened to people. And I think that there has been some forward movement of reparation in small ways, but those ways are small and mostly symbolic. And until the extinction is reversed through the courts, unfortunately, I mean, the federal government could do it tomorrow if they had the courage and the ethics. But until the courts complete this process and the extinction is reversed, and until there is true reparation to the people who were displaced, either monetary, an apology, or even further to that, some kind of psycho-spiritual support for these suffering people. And it's generational now. It's passing through generations. And some people's decision was to just vacate, to leave. And they perhaps have fared in some ways better. The people who've stayed have suffered more. But you know, I don't know what I might have done. It's hard to know. But the commanding lack of empathy, today we must not tolerate the lack of empathy in how we view the history. So the major reservoir that sits behind the Hugh Keenleyside Dam is the Arrow Lakes or Arrow Reservoir. The Arrow Reservoir flooded over two riverine aspects within that larger. The Columbia River is part river, part lake. It flows into two large lakes in the main stem valley of the Upper Columbia, the Upper and the Lower Arrow Lake. And these are the lakes that give the Sinixt their white cultural or settler cultural name of the Arrow Lakes Indians. These riverine systems saw perhaps the heaviest losses. The Arrow Lakes themselves, in some places because of the cliff-side habitat, they're filling basins that are often granite cliffs on either side, had a more limited ecosystem impact, although it was still great for spawning fish of any kind that like that deep, cool water. But those riverine habitats south of the Upper Arrow, between the two Arrow Lakes, and north of the Arrow Lake system on the way to Revelstoke were really heavily impacted for wildlife of all kinds. And it's hard to even really know where to begin, but in the aquatic system there was a massive loss for sturgeon and for other spawning and migratory fish like the bull trout and the rainbow and other fish like that. And on top of that, there were many, many small wetlands, modest wetlands from here to there that would have hosted enormous amounts of waterfowl, migrating trumpeter swans, waterfowl of different kinds. And in fact, the shallow water habitat losses that have been registered and measured by science since the flooding are really some of the greatest losses, because this was a migratory fly-through for those waterfowl. And even once the flooding had happened, they were still conditioned to come through and build nests. They would build their nests and they would have eggs laid in them, and the operations of the reservoir would flood over those nests before they could be hatched out and the babies could be reared. So the animals were still operating under a system that had been abruptly changed with no notice given to them either, and no reparations of any kind made to account for those kinds of habitat losses. So moving on into the terrestrial animals, you had the losses of caribou habitat. A lot of people don't realize that caribou actually depend on sedges in the autumn, which is their time of rut. And traditionally, the Sinixt people would find them in that valley at the narrows between the two lakes, and again between the Upper Arrow and Revelstoke, where there would be many small wetlands and small islands even that had wetland sedge on them, and they were protective areas for the rutting to take place, and they had this food source of the sedges for them to eat. So in the autumn, the caribou would migrate down into the river valley bottoms, where they would find these semi-wetland environments that were heavily populated with sedges that were a food source for them through their autumn rut. And the Sinixt had adapted methods for hunting the caribou from their sturgeon nose canoes, demonstrating that this was an ancient pattern of rutting behavior that allowed for that accessible food source. And so without any sedges, once the reservoir is filling and emptying, that whole area becomes just a silt wasteland that no plants can survive when they're underwater for most of the growing season. So on top of that, you would have the grizzlies, who would come down in the spring to feast on the roots from a lot of these wetland species, and they too would come and find nothing to eat. Not only no fish, but no wetland species as well, or even marginal estuarian species. So there's just so many layers here of losses, and there wasn't a proper registration of how much wildlife there was present before the flooding. There were just guesses made. And so I think in terms of reparation or understanding, we are operating from a deficit position in terms of our ability to know. And to me, that is almost beside the point when you consider if you arrived home one day and found that your house was underwater, and so was your garden, and so was your kitchen, and so was your car, and you had no way to go about your life. And this is what happened for the waterfowl and even the fish and certainly the ungulates who used the riverine valleys before they were flooded. In terms of displacement, between the extinction and displacement of the indigenous people and the displacement of the settler culture for the Columbia River Treaty, in between that time period, right around the time of World War II, there was another displacement that occurred, and that was the displacement of the indigenous salmon that once swam up the Columbia River as far as its headwaters. There were 3 species that came up the main stem of the upper Columbia: the Chinook, who came in the summer or late spring, and the coho, who came in the fall, and the sockeye, who were also a summer arriving or late spring arriving species. And so with those 3 species of fish coming up, the indigenous people had a level of recurring food source right up as far as Revelstoke that they could access. In particular, what one elder once described as the true taproot of the Sinixt tribe was a place that she said was at today's Beaten Arm, which is the mouth of the Ancomaplu River, which was once on early settler maps called the Fish River. And this is the river that flows into the Upper Arrow Lake just as it becomes the river that flows out of Revelstoke. So it's right in this very rich aquatic area where you've got a lake system and 2 river systems meeting. And the Fish River was once a very important salmon river, and also a bull trout spawning river too. So knowing that there was a large Sinixt village there, I think is the clearest sign that there was a tremendous amount of aquatic resources, as well as huckleberries and other things like that, and hunting access into the Ancomaplu River Basin, which is a fairly shallow, low gradient basin that could be accessed more easily. But I think there is a lot of science and a lot of history that we now understand that the salmon are what are known as a trophic species. They're a keystone species that sit near the top. And what that means is that a lot of species benefit from the presence of salmon. And the salmon in the system, even just spawning and dying, create nutrients, both in the water and then as animals carry them up out of the water, they create nutrients into the forest system. So you'll have in the Ancomaplu Basin and up the Revelstoke Reach between Upper Arrow and Revelstoke, cedars of tremendous size. When Gabriel Franchère came through in about 1814 as a member of a fur trade brigade, he noticed in his journals that it was an extraordinary number of large cedars, that he had only seen that large on the coast. Anywhere else that he had not seen such large cedars. So the fact that we were growing cedars of these dimensions in our rainforest, which is kind of a snow forest more than a rainforest, indicated not only that there's lots of water here, but that there were lots of nutrients here. And so the loss of the salmon was directly related to the losses that were to come. It was not a Columbia River Treaty loss. It had already taken place, but it was another in that sequence of losses. And it's very important to recognize also historically that that loss was endorsed by the federal government of Canada. When the U.S. approached Canada about the possibility of creating fish ladders at Grand Coulee Dam, which was the primary obstruction at that time, the U.S. asked Canada, do we need to put fish ladders? Do you have an interest in those fish? And Canada resoundingly and flatly said, no, we have no interest in those fish. The reasoning behind that lack of interest on the federal level has to do with the function of a fish as a commercial fishery, or the function of a fish as a sustainable ecosystem element, and that enriches the entire fishery that surrounds it. Right? So again, those earlier decisions, right up to the Columbia River Treaty being signed, were made with blinders on. There were unique purposes. The salmon were nothing but a commercial resource. The water was nothing but a hydroelectric resource or a flood storage resource. And the people were nothing but people in the way, as the one social history titled in that way states, people in the way. And I've never really understand if that retired BC Hydro officer who wrote that book meant that to be ironic or if he meant it to be true. I think when we talk about industrial development, it's always the non-human, and sometimes even the people themselves who are much in the way. And that's the history of the upper Columbia River. The Columbia River Basin as an entirety, the transboundary Columbia River Basin, is a basin of commanding size and complex hydrology. Currently there are 14 major dams on the main stem of the Columbia River, which runs about 2,000 kilometers from its headwaters at Canal Flats all the way down to the mouth of the river at Astoria, Oregon, just below Portland. So a basin of that size, it includes portions of 7 states and 1 province, and it has a complexity of hydrology that allows for over 400 dams throughout the entire basin, which is the size of France. So we're talking about one of the richest hydrological resources on the continent and perhaps even in the world that is concentrated in this area. And we who live here are part of the Upper Columbia system, which is, without question, in my view as a researcher and studier of the landscape over many years, really the womb of the entire system. This is where a great deal of snow falls, and the snow being the first reservoir, that snow is held in the landscape and then melts slowly. As climate change increases, the value of that upper system snow just increases. Right now, up to 50% of the Columbia's entire flow comes out of the Upper Columbia Basin. As climate change has had its impact, that number has gone from about 35 to 40% when the treaty was signed, right up to 50, and I think we're going to see it go beyond 50% in terms of the Canadian contribution of water and melted snow into the river system. And this has an impact throughout the system for the measurement and the storage of for hydroelectricity. It has an impact for fish and the ability to release cold water into the system to make fish habitat downstream more viable. So when the Columbia River Treaty was signed and designed, about 35 to up to maximum 40% of the water by volume that entered into the Pacific Ocean was from the upper basin in Canada. Now, with climate change, that number is regularly 50%. And sometimes even beyond, for a region that actually only represents about 15% of the entire basin. So we have an outsized contribution when it comes to water and snow, and in particular water temperature, in these giant reservoirs that are storing water at the present moment, primarily for American use. And so it's important as we reconsider the Columbia River Treaty to value even more the contributions that the upper basin are making. And when you do that, you must, in a commensurate way, I believe, value even more the losses. Because those gains that the upper river is providing to the entire system need to be acknowledged on both sides of the boundary. Those gains also need to be acknowledged as having come at a significant and very tragic price. So the Columbia River begins in quite an unusual way. When David Thompson, the first white man to come into the region, crossed the Rocky Mountains and came down the west slope of the Rockies into the upper Columbia drainage, he encountered a river that he believed would be flowing south to the sea. And there was another river that was flowing north, and they were within a mile of each other. And what he encountered in that moment was the unique hydrology and the beginnings of the Columbia, where you have its major tributary, the Kootenay River, beginning on the west slope of the Rockies and coming down into the Rocky Mountain Trench and flowing past the Columbia, which is also beginning in the Rocky Mountain Trench, and they cross within just a mile or less of each other. And in fact, recent research has determined that the Kootenay River, as it passes by the Columbia, actually contributes a significant amount of its volume through the unique design of this subterranean aquifer into the Columbia River itself. So we have these two sister rivers that pass in opposition to each other. And David Thompson chose, I think really logically, it was the right choice for him, knowing nothing, the river that was flowing south, when in fact the Columbia in that spot was the one flowing north. It was counterintuitive for Thompson. It's somewhat counterintuitive if you stare at a map, but it makes Canada and the US both in a unique situation because of the way the Kootenay River flows south, bends down through Montana into Idaho, and then comes into Kootenay Lake. That makes Canada a downstream country because it's passed into the US before it enters back into Canada. And it makes the US a downstream company as a result of the Columbia's path. As it goes north, comes south through the upper Columbia system's landscape, and then crosses the boundary near Trail, British Columbia. So it's a very complex hydrology. I've explained it many times to many people, and it takes a while for people to master it. But it's also a very rich, complexity makes for richness. And it's a very rich ecosystem as well. So to me, there's just endless magic in the way the water operates, and endless benefit. And unfortunately, right now, the management and the understanding of the river is through primarily two very human-centered lenses: flood control and hydroelectric power. And while I recognize and accept and respect those two lenses, I do believe that we can change the operations of the treaty to amend for our past behaviors with regards to other resources in the landscape, whether they be terrestrial, aquatic animals, Indigenous people, or settlers. You know, I have been asked before, how in the world did I get involved in this subject? And my answer is part confusion. I'm not always really sure how I got involved in this subject. I think that really the lens through which I work is the land itself. The land has stories, the land is timeless, the land is rich with meaning and purpose, and it fascinates me to no end what happens when people make contact with landscapes. And that was, perhaps, my overriding interest. But the Columbia River Treaty story is vast, complicated, and in some ways endless. So I really bit off a big one when I started to get curious about this subject. And I spent several years in research, first of all, just trying to master the hydrology, let alone the complexity of the history and the system and the Indigenous people and the settler culture. But once I was all the way down that rabbit hole, the Columbia River Treaty rabbit hole, I call it, once I was all the way down at the bottom of it, I thought, well, who else is ever going to do this? And so, like any good writer would, I wrote my way back out of the rabbit hole. It was not an easy process because it is a very big story, and I think we have to know the story, though. We really have to know this story.